The chamber of the Zorath Dominion shook with echoes of pride as their generals displayed the recordings of their greatest triumphs over the galaxy. Whole fleets reduced to ashes, cities crumbling into dust, and enemy leaders begging for mercy that never came. Their strongest weapon, the rift cannon, was the terror of the stars. It drew power from collapsing singularities and fired bursts of annihilation that ripped apart matter itself. No shield had ever stood against it. No armor had ever endured. No species had ever survived when it was aimed in their direction. For centuries, the Zorath had built their reputation as conquerors by leaning on this weapon, and tonight they planned to prove its supremacy one more time. Only this time, their target was not a fleet or a city, but a single human. Humans had been considered strange ever since they emerged into the galactic scene. They were not the tallest, not the fastest, not the strongest. Their ships were crude, compared to the gleaming constructs of older empires. Their biology seemed unimpressive compared to species who could regrow limbs or survive in the vacuum of space. Yet rumors had spread through the galaxy that humans possessed something that statistics could not measure. There were stories of humans enduring when they should have died, fighting when their bodies should have collapsed, laughing in the face of terrors that made hardened veterans freeze in fear. These were only stories, the Zorath told themselves, and stories were made to be broken. They brought a human prisoner into the arena to demonstrate to the galaxy what happened when myth met reality. The prisoner was Sergeant David Hale of the Earth Expeditionary Corps. He stood in the center of the vast metallic floor, wrists bound by energy cuffs. His uniform burned and torn from previous battles. Above him rose the towering rift cannon, its blackened core pulsing with swirling light like a piece of a dying star trapped in a cage. Thousands of alien spectators filled the stands, their eyes glowing with hunger for spectacle. Holographic transmissions carried the scene to every corner of Zorath space. The general raised his clawed hand and spoke with a voice amplified across the chamber. Tonight, he declared, they would show the galaxy that humans were nothing but fragile myths, easily broken by true power. The rift cannon powered up, the air warping as space itself bent around its charge, and silence fell as all waited to see the human crushed into nothingness. The weapon fired. A roar like thunder splitting the cosmos filled the chamber. A beam of tearing light engulfed Sergeant Hale, swallowing his body in brilliance so fierce that even the spectators shielded their eyes. The floor cracked, the walls shook, and the heat of the discharge melted metal around the impact point. When the light faded, smoke curled into the air, and all that remained was a crater burned deep into the arena floor. The silence that followed was heavy, triumphant, complete. The general spread his arms as if to say, "You see, myths mean nothing against the Zorath." But then a sound broke the silence, faint at first, then growing louder. A laugh. Not a scream, not a groan, not even the gasp of a dying man. It was laughter, full and rich, echoing from the crater. The smoke cleared, and Sergeant Hale stood tall, his cuffs melted away, his skin blackened but unbroken. His uniform was in tatters, but his body still moved. His chest rose with steady breaths, and his face carried the smile of a man amused rather than terrified. He tilted his head back and laughed louder, his voice rolling across the chamber and bouncing from wall to wall. The rift cannon that had shattered cities had failed to even knock him down. The spectators stared in disbelief, whispers rushing through the crowd like wildfire. The general froze, his victory speech dying in his throat, and Sergeant Hale, still laughing, looked straight at the alien leaders and said, "Is that really the best you can do?" The chamber of the Zorath Dominion was a vast hall of steel and shadow, where alien generals gathered to witness the power that had made their empire feared across the stars. They called it the rift cannon, a weapon that bent the fabric of space itself and fired bursts of annihilation that no shield could withstand and no armor could endure. Entire fleets had been torn apart by its fury, and civilizations had vanished in the blink of an eye. The Zorath spoke of it with reverence, as if it was not only their greatest tool of war, but the very symbol of their right to rule. Tonight they prepared a demonstration that would be broadcast to every corner of their empire, a reminder to all who might resist them that the Zorath crushed myths as easily as they crushed bones. And tonight, the myth they sought to crush was humanity. For many cycles, the galaxy had whispered about humans, a species from a small blue world called Earth that had entered space far later than the great empires yet carried themselves as if they belonged among giants. The stories did not make sense to the Zorath because they spoke of fragile beings who bled easily, who lived in environments that seemed hostile even to themselves, yet who refused to die when every calculation said they should. They spoke of soldiers who fought long after their weapons were broken, of explorers who laughed while facing storms that would freeze other species solid, of captives who endured torture and still mocked their captors. To the Zorath, these were exaggerations told by frightened enemies, stories created to give shape to fear. They decided to end those stories forever by selecting a single human soldier, binding him in chains, and placing him at the mercy of their supreme weapon before the eyes of the galaxy. The prisoner they dragged into the arena was Sergeant David Hale of the Earth Expeditionary Corps. His uniform was scorched and torn from battles already fought and lost, his face streaked with grime, his hands bound behind his back by cuffs of glowing energy that hummed with power. He stood in the middle of the circular floor where countless victims had been erased before him, and above him towered the rift cannon, its blackened core swirling with light like a piece of a collapsing star trapped inside a machine. The stands around the arena were filled with alien spectators who hissed and muttered in excitement, their voices blending into a chorus of hunger for destruction. High above, on a platform, stood General Korath, his clawed hand raised high, his voice amplified through the chamber as he declared that tonight the galaxy would see what became of human myths when they faced true power. He promised that the demonstration would end the foolish belief that humans were anything more than fragile animals playing at soldiers. The weapon began to charge, and the air itself rippled as if the universe strained to contain what was about to be unleashed. The hum grew into a roar, the floor trembled, and the light of the rift cannon intensified until shadows danced like flames across the walls. Sergeant Hale did not beg or plead or struggle. He lifted his head and stared directly at the weapon that had destroyed fleets and worlds, his eyes calm and steady, his breath slow and measured. Then the cannon fired. A beam of tearing energy exploded across the arena and swallowed him in blinding light. The sound was like thunder tearing the sky in half, and the heat was so intense that even the armored walls warped and bent. Metal cracked, the floor melted, and the crowd gasped as a crater opened where the human had stood. When the light faded, there was only smoke rising from the impact and silence so complete that every spectator could hear their own hearts pounding. General Korath spread his arms as if to show that the myth was broken, that nothing could survive such power. But before he could speak, a sound rose from the smoke. It was not the cry of a dying creature or the gasp of a wounded man. It was laughter, low at first, and then stronger, echoing against the chamber walls like a drumbeat. The smoke drifted aside, and there stood Sergeant Hale, his cuffs burned away, his body blackened but unbroken, his uniform in tatters yet his posture proud. He tilted his head back and laughed louder, a full and living laugh that rolled across the arena and silenced every voice. The cannon that had shattered cities had not even brought him to his knees. The spectators whispered in disbelief, fear crawling into their eyes as they realized what they were seeing. General Korath froze in place, his mouth half open, his triumph turning to confusion, and the human soldier, still laughing, looked at his captors with a grin that seemed carved from iron and said in a voice that carried through the chamber, "Is that really the best you can do?" The sound of his laughter lingered long after his words faded, and in that silence, the entire chamber seemed to shiver with disbelief. The rift cannon was not simply a weapon, it was a legend in itself, the edge of terror that had carved the Zorath dominion into the galaxy. No creature had ever stood against it. No enemy had ever walked away from its light. Yet before their eyes, a human soldier not only survived but mocked them. General Korath tried to recover his voice and barked an order to fire again, his pride demanding that this strange trick be erased at once. Engineers scrambled, the core of the weapon glowed once more, and another discharge of annihilation thundered into the arena. Again the light swallowed Sergeant Hale. Again the ground shook and the air warped, and again the smoke rose in choking clouds. But when the haze drifted away, the man was still there, still upright, still breathing, and still smiling as if he had been warmed by the sun rather than struck by the most powerful weapon of war in known space. This time his laughter was louder, sharp as steel, and heavy as truth. The spectators could not stay silent. Hisses, gasps, and cries filled the stands. Some shouted that it was a trick, some insisted it was impossible, and some whispered that the old stories might have been true after all. General Korath snarled and pointed at the human, demanding an explanation from the scientists who had sworn that no flesh could endure the rift cannon. The scientists stammered about energy dispersal, about anomalies in the human body, about unknown variables they had never measured, but their words were hollow. The truth was standing in the arena, unbroken, his laughter like a blade cutting through their excuses. The general tried to order more power into the weapon, but the engineers warned that the core could collapse if they pushed further. Fear and confusion spread among them because if their supreme weapon could not bring down one human soldier, then what strength did their empire truly have? Sergeant Hale finally stopped laughing, his voice settling into a calm, steady tone that carried easily through the chamber. He told them that on Earth children grew up facing storms that could level cities, seas that swallowed ships, mountains that froze bones, and jungles that devoured the careless. He told them that his people lived every day on a world that tried to kill them in 1,000 ways, and that this was the forge that shaped humans into what they were. He told them that a beam of light, no matter how fierce, was nothing compared to the weight of Earth's gravity pressing on his bones every moment of his life. Nothing compared to the searing heat of deserts where the air burned. Nothing compared to the cold of winter nights where breath froze in the lungs. He told them that humanity was not a species of myths, but a species of survivors who had already endured weapons greater than anything the galaxy could imagine, because their own world had taught them to laugh in the face of death. The chamber fell into silence again, but this time it was not disbelief, it was fear. The alien spectators looked at each other with dawning realization, whispering that if one human could endure the rift cannon, then perhaps fleets of them could not be stopped. Some left their seats and hurried away, unwilling to watch any longer. General Korath felt his claws tremble as he stared at the man who should have been nothing more than ash. His voice cracked as he demanded the guards to rush in, to cut the human down with blades and claws if energy could not kill him. Warriors leapt into the arena, their armor gleaming, their weapons raised, but as they closed in, Hale only raised his hands and let the cuffs fall in sparks to the floor. His eyes blazed with a fire that no chains could extinguish, and he moved with a strength born not of muscle alone, but of will. The first guard swung a blade and Hale caught it in his bare hand, snapped it like brittle glass, and pushed the warrior to the ground as if he were a child. The second guard tried to stab, but Hale stepped aside, drove his fist into the alien's chest, and sent him sprawling. The crowd roared in terror as the man who had laughed at the cannon now defeated soldiers with his bare hands. General Korath backed away, his confidence collapsing as quickly as the silence had broken. He had wanted a demonstration of power, but instead, he had given the galaxy a demonstration of weakness. The cameras still streamed across the Empire, and billions were watching as the symbol of Zorath's strength failed again and again against one human. Sergeant Hale stood in the center of the arena, surrounded by defeated guards, his chest heaving but his eyes bright, and he lifted his voice one last time to the galaxy. He told them that humanity could not be broken because to break them you would first have to break the Earth itself, and the Earth had been trying for millions of years without success. His words spread through the chamber like wildfire and reached ears far beyond, leaving an unshakable mark on every mind that heard them. The Dominion's War Council gathered in secret chambers carved from black stone, their voices heavy with anger and fear. Reports of what had happened in the arena had already spread beyond their control, carried on stolen transmissions and whispered through countless systems. Whole sectors now spoke of the human who had laughed in the face of the rift cannon, who had broken soldiers with his bare hands, who had stood tall where no being had ever stood before. To the Zorath, this was a disaster greater than any defeat in battle, for their empire was built not only on weapons, but on fear, and that fear was crumbling with every retelling of the story. The generals tried to assure each other that it was a trick, that hidden technology had been used, that sabotage had weakened the weapon, but deep down they felt the truth pressing on their minds. Humanity was not fragile. Humanity was dangerous. On Earth, the news reached faster than the Zorath expected. Human commanders intercepted the broadcasts and saw their captured soldier standing unharmed in the crater of annihilation, his laughter echoing across alien crowds. At first they could not believe it, but when they saw his voice carrying strong and his fists striking down armored warriors, pride surged through every heart. Sergeant Hale had become more than a soldier. He had become a symbol, and symbols are far stronger than any single man. Within days, every military post on Earth displayed his image, and every colony whispered that humanity had been tested by the galaxy's most feared weapon and had not only survived, but laughed. Across human space there was a rising tide of determination, for if one could stand, then all could stand. In the Zorath Council chamber, General Korath slammed his claws against the table and demanded answers from his scientists. How could a species with no armor or energy shielding endure what should have torn apart their very atoms? The scientists studied every recording, every fragment of data, and though their voices shook, they admitted what the evidence showed. The human body carried a strange resilience, a tolerance for pain and stress far beyond what calculations allowed. Their muscles did not fail under strain, their nerves did not collapse under shock, and their willpower drove them beyond the limits that should have broken them. The rift cannon was not built to destroy something that refused to acknowledge destruction. Korath refused to accept such weakness in his empire, so he ordered further tests. He wanted more humans captured, more experiments, more proof that what he had seen was an illusion. He wanted to prove to the galaxy that the myth was false, even as the myth grew stronger with every attempt to deny it. Meanwhile, Sergeant Hale was locked in a prison deep within the Dominion's capital, yet even behind barriers of steel and energy his laughter still echoed. Guards avoided him, speaking in hushed tones, for they swore that when he looked at them his gaze felt heavier than chains. They whispered to each other that perhaps he could not be killed, that perhaps his blood carried some secret fire. Hale sat quietly most days, his body marked by bruises that healed faster than they should, his mind replaying every trial of his life back on Earth. He remembered the freezing winters when he had slept beneath torn tents, the storms that had ripped apart his home, the days of hunger when his stomach ached but he still rose to fight. Compared to those memories, the rift cannon had felt almost hollow, a storm of light, but not of spirit. He knew his people carried that same fire, and he smiled knowing the Zorath could never understand it. Outside his cell, rumors spread like rivers in flood. Traders from distant worlds repeated the tale of the laughing human, and each time it grew, until some said he had stood against 10 beams. Some said he had crushed armored beasts with his bare hands. Some even said he had looked death in the eye and told it to wait. The galaxy loves stories, and once a story takes root, it grows stronger than fact. The Zorath tried to control the flow, but even their allies began to doubt. For empires built on fear cannot afford cracks in their foundation. Already smaller worlds questioned their loyalty, wondering if humanity might be the rising power to follow instead of the Zorath. General Korath grew desperate. He ordered a public trial, not of law, but of endurance. He declared that humans would be tested again before the eyes of the galaxy, that their so-called resilience would be shattered and exposed as nothing more than deception. Preparations began for a grand event larger than the first, with cameras set to broadcast across every known system. They would bring in Hale again, and they would break him or die trying. Yet even as the council planned, the galaxy's people whispered in the shadows that this was not a trial of humanity, but a trial of the Zorath themselves, and many quietly wondered if the Empire was already failing. The day of the trial came, and the Zorath Dominion spared no effort to show their dominance. The great arena was expanded with towering walls of steel and screens that stretched into the skies so that every citizen could watch. Armored legions stood in rows, their weapons gleaming in the light of the twin suns, and banners of the Empire rippled across the wind as if to remind the crowd who still held power. Yet beneath all the display there was a current of unease, for even the proudest soldiers remembered the laughter that had echoed through this same arena not long before. They remembered the man who had stood untouched by the rift cannon, and many wondered if today would reveal truth or humiliation once more. Sergeant David Hale was dragged into the center once again, his wrists bound and his uniform torn, but his posture steady. He looked thinner from weeks of captivity, yet his eyes burned with the same fire that had unsettled guards and shaken generals. Across the galaxy, billions tuned in to watch, from human colonies hidden on the rim to alien capitals that secretly doubted Zorath's strength. This was no longer only about one man or one weapon. It was about the balance of fear that had ruled the stars for generations. If Hale stood again, the Empire's shadow would shrink. If he fell, the myth of humanity would die with him. General Korath stood on his platform and declared that there would be no tricks, no hidden technology, no doubts. He announced that the human would be struck not once but 3 times with the full force of the rift cannon, and that if he survived, the Council would recognize humanity as a species touched by something beyond calculation. His words carried the weight of arrogance and desperation combined, for he knew that anything less would not satisfy the watching galaxy. The weapon charged, its core burning with a brilliance that bent the very air, and once more the arena shook as its energy
gathered.
The crowd held its breath as the beam thundered down. Light swallowed Hale and the ground cracked under the force, but when the smoke lifted, the man still stood, coughing but smiling. Gasps rushed across the arena, and Korath snarled to fire, again. The cannon roared a second time, brighter, hotter, so strong that soldiers near the walls shielded themselves. Yet when the haze cleared, the human remained alive. One knee bent for a moment, but then straightening with stubborn pride. His lips curved into a grin that made even the bravest warrior flinch. The general's voice shook as he demanded the 3rd shot, the last chance to prove their supremacy. Engineers hesitated, fearing collapse, but the order rang louder than their doubt. The 3rd blast erupted like a piece of the sun had been unleashed, tearing across the arena and blasting the ground into shards of molten rock. For long moments no one could see through the blinding storm, and many believed that finally the human had been erased. But slowly a figure rose from the crater, burned, bloodied, swaying, yet alive. Hale's voice cracked as he laughed again, weaker but still sharp enough to carry across the chamber. He raised one fist into the air and shouted that this was humanity, that they did not bow to storms or to weapons, that they endured because endurance was written in their very bones. His voice carried through every transmission, reaching billions who listened in stunned silence. The crowd of aliens erupted into chaos. Some screamed in terror, some fled the stands, some dropped their weapons as if they had been struck themselves. The myth had not only survived, but had grown into something undeniable. General Korath's face twisted with rage and despair, for he knew that his empire's greatest weapon had become powerless in the eyes of the galaxy. Every ally watching from afar would now question their loyalty, every rival would see weakness, and every slave world would begin to dream of rebellion. The rift cannon was no longer a symbol of domination, it was a symbol of failure, and that failure had a human laugh carved into its heart. Hale collapsed to one knee, his body trembling, but he kept his head high. Guards rushed toward him, but stopped halfway, fear rooting their feet, for none wished to be the one to face him again. Even in weakness, he carried the presence of something larger than himself, something that whispered that Earth had given birth to warriors no empire could contain. The trial that was meant to break him had instead broken the mask of Zorath invincibility. The galaxy had seen it and could never unsee it. Hale lifted his voice one last time before falling silent, telling them that humans were not special because they could not be destroyed, but because they refused to stop standing no matter how many times they were struck. His words hung in the air like a prophecy, and in that moment the myth of humanity became truth. The trial that was meant to crush humanity did not end in silence. It ended in chaos that spread like fire across the stars. News of Sergeant Hale, standing against 3 full blasts of the rift cannon, could not be contained, for transmissions had already been carried on black channels, and smugglers had smuggled fragments of recordings to every hidden port. Within days, the image of a lone human raising his fist inside the crater of annihilation was painted on walls, etched into datapads, whispered in the markets of slave worlds, and sung in the taverns of distant colonies. What was once rumor had become a symbol, and what was once a soldier had become a legend. On Earth, leaders gathered in underground halls where maps of the galaxy flickered with enemy strongholds. They had known that war with the Dominion was inevitable, but Hale's defiance had shifted the tide before a single fleet was moved. Human generals spoke of morale as a weapon sharper than steel, and they knew that the galaxy now saw them as something more than another young species. Colonists who had once feared Zorath patrols now carried themselves with pride, and soldiers who had once doubted their strength now demanded to fight. Every man and woman who heard the story felt a spark in their chest, for the message was simple. If one of them could laugh in the face of annihilation, then perhaps all of them could. Within the Dominion, the effect was the opposite. Soldiers who had marched with pride now looked over their shoulders, whispering about the human who would not die. Some spoke openly that their empire had grown soft behind the shield of a weapon that no longer commanded fear. Slave races that had once obeyed without question now tested their chains, some refusing orders, some striking down overseers, all fueled by the belief that the Zorath could be beaten. The council tried to respond with brutality, executing rebels and silencing dissent, but the harder they struck, the faster the unrest grew. Every act of cruelty was met with stories of Hale's laughter. Every execution was met with murals painted in secret, showing a human standing tall in fire. Sergeant Hale himself lay in a cell deep beneath the Capitol, his body covered in burns and his strength drained, yet even in pain, he smiled. Guards avoided his gaze, for they swore that when he looked at them, it felt as if he could see through their armor and into their hearts. Some even whispered that he healed faster than normal, that he was being kept alive by some force the Dominion could not measure. Hale knew the truth was simpler. He was human, and humans had been forged by hardship long before the Zorath had even discovered the stars. He thought of his comrades far away, of Earth with its storms and deserts and mountains, and he felt no fear. If he died, his death would only make the legend stronger. If he lived, the legend would continue to grow. Either way, humanity had already won something greater than battle. In the wider galaxy, neutral empires watched with fascination. Some had lived under the shadow of the Zorath for centuries, and now they saw cracks spreading across the mask of invincibility. Merchants whispered that new alliances might be forming, that perhaps it was time to stand with humans instead of against them. Small fleets began to vanish from Dominion space as allies quietly withdrew their support, unwilling to tie their fate to a power that could not silence a single man. The Dominion's diplomats tried to insist that the trial had been nothing but spectacle, that the human had been weakened and would soon be executed, but their words carried no weight. Once a story has touched the heart of a galaxy, no decree can erase it. General Korath raged in the council chamber, demanding that Hale be destroyed in secret before his image grew any larger, but others cautioned him. They argued that to kill the man now would only make him a martyr, that the galaxy would believe he had been too strong to defeat and had to be silenced like a god. Korath slammed his claws and swore that humanity would not rise under his watch, but even his voice sounded hollow, for he too had felt the tremble in his soldiers when the human stood tall. And so the council planned a new trial, one that would go beyond weapons. They decided to test not only Hale but other captured humans, believing that perhaps the first was an anomaly. They ordered scouts to capture more soldiers and civilians, to drag them across the stars and prove that the myth was nothing but luck. Yet the very order revealed their fear, for if they truly believed humanity weak, they would not need such tests. Deep inside, they already knew the truth, and that truth frightened them more than any weapon. The order to capture more humans was carried out with haste and fear, and across the borders of human space, Zorath raiders struck like shadows in the night. They expected screams and panic, but instead they found resistance fiercer than they had ever faced. On colony worlds, farmers armed with nothing but tools fought like soldiers, refusing to surrender even when ships blotted out the sky. On mining stations, workers used their drills and machines to drive back boarding parties, their eyes burning with the same stubborn defiance that Sergeant Hale had shown. The Zorath did succeed in capturing a handful of humans, yet every raid cost them dearly, for each human fought as if their life was not their own but part of something greater, and each captured prisoner walked into chains with heads held high, knowing that their endurance would become another spark in the fire that now spread across the galaxy. The Dominion gathered the prisoners and placed them in the arena once more, seeking to break the myth with numbers. This time it was not one soldier but 10, men and women drawn from different corners of Earth's scattered colonies. They were chained, beaten, deprived of rest. Yet when the gates opened and they stood, together, in the center of the arena they locked eyes and smiled faintly, as if they already knew what was expected. General Korath declared that they would each be struck by the rift cannon until the galaxy saw truth, and he swore that no human would walk away. The weapon roared and the first blast engulfed the group in a storm of light, but when the smoke cleared, 9 of them still stood, their bodies burned but their voices rising in laughter. The 10th had fallen, his chest still, yet even in death, his face carried a smile. The crowd erupted in panic, for it was one thing for a single man to survive, but another for nearly all to endure together. Soldiers muttered among themselves, unable to deny what their own eyes had seen, and slaves watching from hidden corners began to chant the word human like it was a prayer. Korath raged and demanded another strike, but engineers warned that the weapon could not be fired again so soon without collapse. In desperation, he ordered soldiers into the arena, yet even weakened and bleeding, the humans fought with hands and feet and teeth, striking down armored warriors and forcing others to hesitate. The arena floor became a battlefield, and once again the galaxy saw that humans did not surrender, that even chained and wounded they carried war in their very blood. News of the trial spread faster than any fleet could move. On worlds ruled by the Dominion, slaves rose in rebellion, painting the human symbol on walls and declaring that if one species could defy the Empire, then so could they. On neutral stations, merchants whispered that the Zorath were finished, that the age of their domination was crumbling, and many began to withdraw their trade in secret. Within human space, the story of the 10 prisoners ignited a storm of unity. Colonies that had once argued over resources now sent ships to aid one another. Commanders who had once been cautious now spoke boldly of war, and fleets began to assemble not only to defend but to strike back. Humanity had become more than a scattered people. It had become a force bound together by legend. Sergeant Hale remained alive in his cell, weakened but aware of what was happening beyond his walls. Guards carried whispers even when they tried not to, and he pieced together the truth. He knew that his laughter had been the spark, but it was no longer his alone. The flame had spread to every human heart, and now it burned in places he would never see. He sat in the dark and smiled, telling himself that even if he died tomorrow, the story would live forever. For a man can be killed, but a story cannot. And the Zorath had given humanity the greatest story of all. The Council of the Dominion grew desperate as rebellion spread, and allies fell silent. Korath demanded one final show of strength, something that would either restore fear or doom them completely. He proposed unleashing the rift cannon not on a prisoner, but on an entire human fleet, proving that whatever resilience individuals showed could not withstand the destruction of thousands. The council hesitated, for such a gamble could destroy their last shred of authority. Yet in the end, fear made them agree. They would lure the humans into battle. They would fire the weapon, at full power, and they would pray that the galaxy would see humanity broken at last. But the galaxy had already seen too much. The laughter of one man had spread to billions, and whether fleets burned or survived, no one could erase the memory of that sound. The Zorath did not yet realize it, but the war they hoped to win had already slipped from their grasp, for their greatest weapon had failed not only against flesh but against spirit, and spirit was a force no empire could conquer. The human fleet approached the designated battlefield with a quiet that belied the storm about to erupt, and every ship carried the weight of countless stories of survival and laughter that had spread across the galaxy. They were no longer just a fleet. They were a symbol, a force of unyielding will, a testament to the stubbornness of a species that refused to die. The Zorath awaited them with weapons primed, with fleets assembled in perfect formation, expecting fear, expecting submission, expecting silence. Yet all they would find was defiance, shining brighter than any star. Sergeant Hale, standing on the bridge of the lead human warship, looked out at the enemy lines and felt a strange calm. knowing that whatever happened next would not be the end, but a beginning. When the first Zorath ships opened fire, a cascade of light cut across space, missiles streaking like falling comets, energy beams igniting the void with deadly brilliance. Humans returned fire not with panic but with precision, with instinct honed through years of survival, with the courage of those who had already stared death in the face and laughed. Fleets collided with thunderous impact, and still the humans pressed forward, their laughter now carrying through comm channels and through the void itself, echoing in places the Zorath could not comprehend. It was more than sound. It was a statement, a challenge, and the alien commanders felt it deep in their bones, a chill of dread that no strategy could erase. The rift cannon was ready, aimed at the human flagship, capable of erasing all resistance, in a single strike, and the Council of the Dominion watched with expectation. They did not yet understand that the humans had anticipated this, and had prepared in ways that defied every calculation. Shields shimmered with energy harvested from hidden reactors, fleets maneuvered with precision that turned predictions into traps. And when the rift cannon fired, it struck not with annihilation but with reflection, its energy diverted and absorbed, sending shockwaves back through the enemy ranks. Ships were torn apart, but so were the arrogance and certainty of those who thought themselves gods of war, and the humans moved forward, unbroken, unstoppable. On the bridge of the flagship, Sergeant Hale looked at his crew, faces glowing with determination, eyes burning with the knowledge that they were carrying more than weapons or ships. They carried the will of humanity itself. Communication channels lit up with messages of triumph and defiance, every colony, every hidden settlement sending courage into the fight. And in that moment, a new reality crystallized for the galaxy. Humans were no longer to be underestimated, no longer to be enslaved, no longer to be treated as fragile creatures of flesh and fear. They were predators in their own right, hunters of opportunity, masters of resilience, and the universe could either recognize it or perish under the truth of it. The Zorath fleet faltered, command collapsing as one surprise followed another. Their own weapons betrayed them, their strategy rendered obsolete, their arrogance shattered against the simple but unstoppable force of human resolve. And as the humans pressed forward, as ships fell into formation around each other with perfect harmony, Sergeant Hale could not help but remember the laughter that had started it all, the laughter that had ignited hope, the laughter that had become legend. That sound carried across battlefields, across stars, and across minds. A sound that no weapon could silence. A sound that transformed fear into courage, weakness into strength, and the impossible into reality. When the last Zorath command ship fell, when the fleet scattered into retreat, when silence finally descended upon the battlefield, humanity did not cheer in arrogance or rage. They simply breathed, felt the weight of survival and triumph together, and smiled. They had been struck by the strongest weapon, faced the might of a galaxy-spanning empire, and yet they had not only survived, but prevailed. And as they looked to the stars, they knew that this was not an end, but the beginning of a new era. One where humanity would carve its place not with fear but with courage, with laughter, and with the indomitable will to endure. Sergeant Hale stood on the bridge, hands resting on the console, looking at the stars that had once seemed so distant, and now felt like home. The galaxy had learned a lesson that could never be forgotten. Strike a human with your strongest weapon, and you may kill a body, but you cannot kill their spirit. You may silence a moment, but you cannot silence their story. And above all, you may conquer worlds, but you will never conquer the heart of humanity. And in that truth lay the triumph of a species that had always been underestimated and would forever be unforgettable. The battlefield was silent, yet alive with tension and energy as the humans drifted through the remnants of the shattered fleets, their ships glowing softly against the black canvas of space. Every engine hum a heartbeat of a species that refused to bow to fear or reason. The Zorath, once proud and confident, had vanished into the darkness, leaving behind debris and echoes of a power that had believed itself absolute. And now the humans moved like shadows of inevitability across the void, aware that every moment was proof of their survival, proof of their defiance, proof of everything that had been doubted about them for centuries. Sergeant Hale walked through the corridors of the flagship, feeling the vibrations of a ship alive with victory, yet tempered with the understanding that survival was not the same as triumph, that the galaxy would remember but would also watch, waiting for mistakes that humans had no intention of committing. Around him, the crew celebrated quietly, sharing stories of battles narrowly won, of weapons mastered against impossible odds, of moments when laughter had carried them through despair. And it was in those stories that the real victory existed, not in the destroyed fleets or scattered weapons, but in the unbreakable spirit of a people who had learned to smile at danger, to mock death, to turn despair into energy and use it to fuel their will. Across the communications network, colonies whispered congratulations and shared tales of unexpected bravery, of citizens who had refused to surrender even when planets were bombarded and cities razed, and every message carried the same truth. Humanity would not be extinguished. Humanity would not be bowed. Humanity would laugh even when faced with annihilation. The galaxy itself seemed to take notice as reports filtered into systems that had once scoffed at Earth and its people, that had dismissed them as insignificant, fragile, unworthy of attention, and now those same systems paused and reconsidered, calculating the unthinkable, realizing that humans were more than survivalists, more than opportunists, more than a simple species with claws and teeth. Humans were unpredictable, unstoppable, and utterly terrifying in the beauty of their resilience, and every world that had once plotted against them began to understand that laughter was not weakness, defiance was not rebellion, and hope was a weapon stronger than any cannon or beam. Sergeant Hale stood alone on the observation deck, looking out at the swirling colors of distant nebulae, feeling the enormity of what had been accomplished and the weight of what lay ahead. And yet there was no fear in him, only anticipation and pride, knowing that humans had faced the ultimate test and passed not by cunning alone, not by strength alone, but by a combination of daring, unpredictability, and the irrepressible joy of being alive. The laughter that had started as a small, defiant sound in the midst of terror had grown to become a legend, a signal, a warning, and a promise, all at once. And every human who had survived that battle carried it within. A spark that could ignite civilizations or shatter empires depending on the whims of courage and imagination. As the last remnants of the Zorith fleet disappeared beyond known space and the human ships formed a silent line of quiet dominance, the crew looked at each other, not as soldiers but as witnesses to history, participants in a story that would echo across star systems for generations. There was no boasting, no arrogance, no celebration of destruction, only a deep understanding that survival was precious, that resilience was rare, and that the galaxy had finally seen what it meant to strike a human with its strongest weapon, and fail utterly to break the one thing that could never be conquered, the human heart. Hale took a deep breath, feeling the vibration of the engines beneath his feet, listening to the low hum of life and victory and harmony, and he smiled softly, thinking of all the battles yet to come, all the stars yet to explore, all the challenges that would try to test them again, knowing that no matter what the galaxy threw at them, humans would face it with courage, laughter, and an unshakable spirit that could never be extinguished or defeated. And in that truth lay the greatest victory of all, a reminder that humanity was no longer to be measured by fear, but by strength, by will, and by the unyielding refusal to bow even to the mightiest of foes. The end.